All right, so today I'm going to be, in order to cover a lot of bases in a half an hour or less, and in order to make sure I kind of touch upon some of the interests or some of the curiosities that you all have coming from different backgrounds intellectually and politically. I know we have a lot of activists in the room. I know we have a lot of social justice movement organizers and then students of all levels. So I want to basically take us on a brief historical journey and then also map out then some of the formations and contradictions that beset the revolution today in order to create a bit of a map into which we'll step our stars from Egypt and provide you some very exciting insider's view of what's going on in these times today. All right, so today we're going to start taking us way back, way back to the 1990s, when, as we all know, history ended with a bang, when, as we know, the mainstream political and intellectual elite came to the conclusion that history had ended, since we no longer needed revolutions, we no longer needed mass social solidarity to mobilize, because we had reached a point with the end of the Cold War and the fall of the Berlin Wall in which basically politics would be reduced to individuals refining their choices in the market, of making electoral choices, making consumer choices as individuals, niche marketing their identities within a kind of broad spectrum of open and fluid political forms and relations. As we know, Thatcher declared that society no longer existed, and plenty of, leftists also declared that mass social class formations also no longer were so important to history. Politics would be either guided by the invisible hand or the individual choice, and big, large-scale actors would fade as being so useful, either as analytical frames or as actors on the world stage. Then, as we know, very suddenly, as the work of Eqbal Ahmad predicted very clearly in his late 1990s work, history would return with a vengeance, of course, history being medieval history. We returned in the year 2001, of course, to the era of the Crusades, in which the world was going to be a absolute battle between absolutist political forms, in which again the social played no role, and instead we had culture with a capital C or a capital K, depending on how you interpret it. Culture being a massive monolithic set of prescriptions and norms operated either by militarized West or by the ideologically unnegotiable power of Islam. So we had again, history returns, but it's a particular kind of history, again, without any role for the social, without any role for class. We moved from a historyless world to a world in which history was defined as irreconcilable apolitical culture, militarized and ideologized in the extreme. The political actors, the market, at least seemed on the level of discourse to pull back, and instead the actors in the political sphere were the occupiers, the terrorists, the bombers from the sky, or the self-bombers. And we had, again, where was the place for society? Where was the place for large-scale narratives of the people, of social actors, and large frameworks of solidarity and action that could actually move social justice as a historical actor forward? Of course, we know that the Arab street was a major pseudo-actor that appears during this period, but in this case, as, of course, basically a metaphor for the mob, as a kind of terrorist version of the mob, infused with hypermasculinity, something irrational, something not capable of either market individuality and market rationality, nor capable of anything like social movement identity, meaning something that would link to a set of economic and social claims or broader frameworks of movement. So then, again, we have a major shift. So thank goodness we have another era begins in 2011, in which history, again, becomes imaginable, in which the history lurches forward again, and we suddenly begin to talk about the word the future. In the initial weeks of the Egyptian Revolution, you actually had parties trying to form new parties forming, and often in the first paragraph of their initial manifestos was the word the future. What is the future for the people? What is the future for the youth? The youth itself becomes a fetish subject that we all begin to become fascinated with and center again, because the youth, again, whether it's glamorized as a kind of figure of modern technology or whether it's studied seriously as a problem of social marginalization, unemployment, youth raises again the question of the future and raises again the question of the social. So with particularly the Egyptian Revolution, not at all to marginalize the role of Tunis in this, but the Egyptian Revolution, because it had this performative, mass-mediated character in which an entirely new category of the social was presented, something which, mistakenly or not, Western viewers identified with all too easily as a kind of general category of a moment, an entire mass of humanity with which they could identify, whose momentum was propelling itself toward the future, towards new beginnings. The future begins to appear again as a subject of history. And the people, of course we know the people can be a very totalitarian category, can be also stripped of what the social means to us as activists, as social justice activists. But the people at least returns as a category to struggle over. The people meaning the social, sociality, making claims for social justice. That's what the people, at least in a very general sense, means. So we know all Arab revolutions have the same slogan, begins and ends with the same slogan, الشعب يريد إسقاط النظام. The people want the fall of the regime. So if there's one thing all Arab revolutions have in common, is they begin with the notion of the people. They don't begin with the notion of identity politics in this case. They don't begin with a notion of Islam is the solution. They don't begin with the notion of Islam versus globalization or the East versus the West. They begin with the notion of the people. The people meaning society making claims upon those which have stripped it of its sovereignty, of its social sovereignty. So of course we know that this was like any revolution. Revolutions are about manipulating wedges of the power apparatus one against each other, making sustained, hard-working, unstopping, tireless efforts to deploy those wedges in ways that can destabilize the hard apparatus of domination and somehow open up a window to the reconfiguration of power. So revolutions are never easy, they're never clean, they're always years and years of hard work. But let's assess a little bit what state of revolution we have now in Egypt. First of all, there's of course different kinds of revolution. It's easy, there's of course anybody who wants to make a kind of point and look like they're more mature than people like me, they're going to say, well, this isn't a revolution, right? It's not a revolution until this and this and this and this happens. Well, there's many different kinds of revolution, and people on the ground want it to be a revolution, and they're dying to make it a revolution, literally. So who am I to tell them it's not a revolution? But we can tell them it's a certain kind of revolution if we want to. We can establish some kind of categorical distinctions. A political revolution is a revolution in which most of the state apparatus is changed definitively in terms of who is managing them and what their aims are. The revolution against apartheid and the entry of the ANC is a political revolution. New constitution, new governing party, new faces at the top. Social revolution is where the class structure changes, where the dominant class is changed, where it's overthrown, and maybe the main heights of the economy are radically restructured. Most people would say, for example, that the South African struggle against apartheid did not entail a full social revolution, since most of white capital maintained its power, most of the kind of neoliberal corporate power was maintained, and only a small black middle class was admitted to the social dominant classes. So the Egyptian Revolution is still in the process of challenging many aspects of the old state of Mubarak. It's not yet a full political revolution, although obviously some aspects of that have been achieved. We have a new parliament, I'm sure myself, the other speakers will talk about and you will ask questions about, which is a highly disappointing and fractious but absolutely fascinating and circus-like subject. So it's certainly not the same parliament as under Mubarak, but still, limited political revolution, certainly not yet a social revolution, although in many ways the vivid presence in the public sphere, which I'm going to discuss, of working classes and of gendered working classes is huge and has definitely the potential for some aspects of social revolution in the medium or longer term. What the Egyptian revolution certainly is a civic revolution, meaning public spaces have been utterly transformed. The notion of what the public is, what the people is, what their claims are, where they are located in the political universe is utterly transformed. We all know that you can talk to people in cabs and cafes in the street about a whole host of complex political phenomenon anywhere in Egypt, and you'll have a whole host of new responses, new positions, new spaces to talk about them. It's certainly a civic revolution. And it's also very much a revolution in consciousness, again, because people are talking about every detail of social policy, labor policy, the difference between various Islamic groupings, the legacies of Nasser, the role of the Saudis and Iranians in the polity. A whole new set of issues are now made conscious with new, very useful frames and critical frames of analysis put around them for many people. So, the civic revolution, I don't have time to go through the whole revolution in Egypt. I assume many of you have been following events during the last year. But briefly, the civic revolution, meaning the revolution of public space, which was so spectacularly broadcast on cable and social media, which isn't to say that social media and cable caused the civic revolution, but we all became familiar with it through that in some ways, was caused roughly by a combination of labor movements that have been mobilizing since 2006, acceleratingly since 2008, and very strongly in 2009, 2010, which had succeeded in December 2010 in establishing a national independent labor federation based primarily in mobilizations around textile and spinning factories. Many, of course, textile workers are women, so women were absolutely central in some of the most militant labor protests. Then the I Am Khalid Said movement, which is an anti-police brutality movement, which is massive, which had millions of followers, and which started this process of crossing the boundary between working class issues and middle class issues, of liberal issues and kind of socialistic labor and working class issues. Police brutality, this guy here, Khalid Said, became a kind of martyr, a kind of himself, a kind of lower middle class cyber cafe type with a bit of a political protest voice, but became basically a kind of icon of the boy marginalized by unemployment, by the police state. Then we have the question of technology, which is a huge issue that I'm sure a lot of you thought about, and which I want to point at, but then caution as a framework for analyzing the revolution. I think a lot of people, of course, in the West, access the revolution through Facebook and other technologies and imagine the revolution as driven by this mix of youth, alienated youth, plus modern technology. But that is a little bit too easy and too reassuring for us. I think a lot of people thought of the revolution as driven by youth and technology because one assumes that youth and technology produces something that we in the West can see as a future that is safe, that is fun, that is oriented towards individual expressivity and consumption. But of course, the youth issues in Egypt are not purely those of expression, not purely those of technological advancement. There are also some much broader issues that we're going to then address as we move forward. And of course, what also this discourse of technology and Facebook at the heart of the revolution cuts out is that if you'll remember in the last November and December 2010, on the eve of the revolution, it wasn't Facebook or Twitter that was the great revolutionary web presence in the world, but it was WikiLeaks and the various hacktivism forms of uprising that had swept the world. We all started talking about first uprisings in Tunisia as a WikiLeaks revolution. But of course, WikiLeaks is not a large profit-making American corporation that has hundreds of PR representatives working for them. So of course, Facebook then became the champion of the revolution using this kind of PR appropriation. Of course, WikiLeaks has been forgotten as a part of the revolutionary fabric. But so forms of activism in Egypt, stealing security files and turning them back to to the people surveilled by them, surveilling the security state, hacking into the security state, putting up files and videos of security officers and informants online, this kind of very aggressive forms of online activism. Now that might be really relevant to the revolution, much more than Facebook as a social tool for a particular class of people. But anyway, of course, the idea of the revolution being driven by Facebook was, in a sense, disproven by Mubarak himself. Because we know we have the perfect social science test situation in which, at the height of those 18 days of Tahrir uprising, all cell phones and all internet were shut off. And did the revolution dissolve and die? No, it continued to increase and grow. The actual on-the-ground social connections that people were building over the years were able to continue to expand and intensify without cell phones and the internet. So that's the civic part of the revolution. We had labor movements, we had anti-police brutality movement, we had new forms of youth, yes, with some interesting and aggressive forms of technological appropriation, succeeded in changing to some degree the civic sphere. Then we have this revolution in consciousness, which separates the era of the war on terror from the era of the Arab Spring, which is completely and radically distinct in the kind of terms and discourse that occupy not just the media, but the state in Egypt itself. We begin the revolution, we still have these discourses of stability, kind of civilization, versus the mob, the Arab street. We still had the mainstream discourse of CNN and of the State Department of the United States was, we must preserve stability, right? Civilization against the mob, the Arab street, basically hypermasculine, terrorist, working class, unemployed, all that massive problems fused together. But then we had this very fast, amazingly fast process of change in which that discourse of civilization versus the Arab street, stability versus possible terrorism, changed, and we had a bridging of the kind of working class, middle class divide in Tahrir Square itself, in the Tahrir process of occupying that square and occupying the media and aggressively re-territorializing Cairo. And these binaries began to fade between secular and religious, at least for the time. We had a lot of religious groups, Youth of the Brotherhood, Sufi groups, new anti-church Christian groups from the Coptic groups in Egypt joining with the revolutionary movements. So we had a kind of blurring of this secular versus religious boundary. And then, of course, the famous Anderson Cooper effect. Anderson Cooper, wading into the mobs, is attacked by pro-Mubarak. Remember when they used to call them pro-Mubarak protesters? The anti-Mubarak protesters and the pro-Mubarak protesters. So the pro-Mubarak protesters beat the crap out of Anderson Cooper, one of the wonderful brutal actions of history that we can be so thankful for. And after that, he stops using this discourse of stability. He doesn't say, oh, the pro-Mubarak, he starts saying the people and the repressors or the thugs. There's the people versus the thugs. So instead of pro-Mubarak, anti-Mubarak became the people versus the thugs. He started using the discourse of the Egyptian revolution itself. And then eventually the State Department started to use that. Not that, again, the United States was making decisions about where this was going, but that makes a huge difference in terms of why the Egyptian revolution became iconic, became a kind of subject of true excitement and love amongst really kind of a global activist solidarity network. So we had the Anderson Cooper effect, meaning that we lost the final death of this war on terror discourse of civilization and stability versus the mob and terrorism. So when Omar Suleiman comes in, he's the kind of Dick Cheney, CIA, kind of dark, Darth Vader of Egypt. He comes in, kicks out Mubarak, and everyone, this was always the plan, right? I remember Mozn Hassan here 2 years before the revolution said that this is what exactly was going to happen. Omar Suleiman was going to come in, was going to save Egypt, kick out Mubarak, and then the intelligence apparatus, which Omar Suleiman represented, chief of the Egyptian CIA, was going to then have this even more repressive but kind of more, smoothed out, neoliberalized state. But as someone completely saturated in the old consciousness of the War on Terror, who had not assimilated or recognized at all the new discourse of popular sovereignty of the people, the end, he did not recognize the end of the War on Terror. His famous two speeches that he made after he became basically acting president was the classic speech about terrorism and conspiracy. You know, he blamed the revolution on a conspiracy between Hezbollah and Anderson Cooper, between Hamas and CNN, between Facebook, and he talks about Facebook as if it's some bomb that you're hiding somewhere in your clothes. I mean, so the speeches he makes very much are about conspiracy. They're very much about terrorism. They understand everything in the street is happening is a threat to civilization, driven by kind of combination of outside technological media and terrorists. Now, what is so amazing? You know, this could have made a perfectly good, inaugural speech for Bush's third term or something like that. But it was no longer comprehensible, even by the right wing at this point. It was so laughable and so ridiculous that even within the Egyptian elite, he had to go. This framing of the people now as terrorists, as a conspiracy, as this international mix of liberal media and terrorist groups was completely incomprehensible because a revolution in consciousness had actually occurred thanks to the occupation of Tahrir and the particular new forms of solidarity that produced, and also the semi-accidental, fortunate interactions with the US media that happened. So Omar Suleiman disappears, and with him, the last hardcore remnants of then the War on Terror discourse. Of course, that doesn't mean that repression ended with it, unfortunately. So, and at this point, we have this hope with then Mubarak gone and then Omar Suleiman gone, and in comes the military. So this is the moment in which we hope that we can start to push forward, that Egypt can start to articulate this redistribution coalition, this new kind of popular sovereignty based upon the people sovereignly occupying the public sphere in these new ways and creating new state institutions at the intersection of independent labor federations, the Muslim Brothers Youth, new forms of anti-police brutality movement, new kinds of politicization that overcome this kind of secular Islamic divide or secular religious divide, moving towards this new kind of redistributive model. Of course, as we know, there's been a lot of back and forth and a lot of shifts since then in Egypt. We've seen basically a kind of pact that even began during the 18 days of the uprising against Mubarak, basically a de facto pact since as early as March between the old guard of the Muslim Brothers and the military rulers of Egypt. We've seen the creation of an alternative public sphere to that of the revolutionized civic sphere of Tahrir, creating the electoral realm of elections as an alternative, more legitimate public sphere than Tahrir, but of course with the elections completely controlled and narrowed and riddled with impossible regulations that would make it very difficult for youth parties to participate, and if they did, the media and the military-controlled media or the Saudi-controlled electoral finance mechanisms, both completely excluding support for the new youth Tahrir movements. And then, of course, the marginalization of the progressive religious actors and the return of old guard, very old guard usually, in their 80s often, religious leaders in order to return to an old form of populism. Then in December, November through January, we have the elections that go on and on and on. And what happened, as you probably know, is that there was about 46% support for the Muslim Brothers, about 15% support for the Salafis, is that right?
90%.
19?
90.
Not 90 for the Salafis,
19,
19, okay. So very strong support. Now my quick 2-second explanation for what this is not that Egyptians didn't know what they were doing or that they were inexperienced, because they actually did make some very interesting and bold and surprising choices. But their choices were not between Tahrir, the youth, progressive left movements, and either the old guard or the religious movements, because remember, none of the leftist parties had any real significant presence in the electoral rolls. They were not organized, they were not recognized, they were not funded, they were not able to access the media, and 12,000 of them were in military detention. So Carter Center saying that these are free and fair elections, that's absolutely ridiculous. The elections were not between the leftists of Tahrir and the old guard. The elections were either between Mubarak's cronies running as independents, between the Muslim Brothers, who basically represented the military and instability, and the Salafis, who were in essence the only kind of opposition which people knew were fiercely anti-corruption, fiercely pro-public morality, but an open question as to what they were going to do politically. So my view is that the swing behind the Brothers and the Salafis was a very interesting and actually a kind of welcome shift in a sense, because even though we personally would have loved to have more of the youth and left parties elected, at least this means that Egyptians are making a very intelligent choice to absolutely reject the Mubarak cronies, and we're either choosing to thank the military and the Brothers for stability, or else to just kind of make a protest vote against the whole system with the Salafis. So it's an interesting result, even though politically we end up with basically a rather right-wing kind of morality obsessed parliament. So basically in this new electoral phase, we have now a different coalition coming to power in the electoral sphere, which again is not the whole public sphere. It's not the whole civic sphere at all. Matter of fact, it's kind of weak and so contentious and so circus-like that it doesn't necessarily dominate public politics at all. But in this entitlement coalition for prerogative sovereignty instead of popular sovereignty, we have an intersection of the old Muslim Brothers and conservative syndicate leaders, professional leaders, the military and their businesses. Military are very much big business people, monopoly capitalists in certain sectors, Saudi petrodollars that bankroll the right-wing parties in the elections, just like the Koch brothers in the United States do, and the mukhabarat and the parastatal security industries battling it out with working class boys in the street or with gender protesters in Tahrir. So this becomes the formal elected state and the SCAF version of the public sphere. So what we're left with at this point are two completely distinct but very interestingly dynamic, contentious public spheres operating in Egypt. One, the result of the revolution in consciousness and the civic revolution of January and February, and another, the result of the elections. So here we have, for example, I don't know if you can see it in this light, but here we have some Brotherhood candidates that are laughing and rolling their eyes while a Salafi guy in the middle of a speech, a debate on the floor, stands up and starts giving the call to prayer, singing in full voice in the middle of the debate. And you see the people below him, very conservative people, are already kind of, this tension, this kind of embarrassment between different Islamic groups is producing, and this is broadcast live on television, and it's really becoming a kind of, Egyptians love to go to long improvised theater pieces that can last like 7 hours already. So this is like no problem for them to watch these hours and hours of debates in which people are doing ridiculous improvisations, but this, on moral piety, on moral rigidity, on, who can be more, pure than the next guy, this kind of balance between these old men, just circus-like in its character. So in the opening, broken open by this conflict between two very different public spaces, we have what's now an open cultural rebellion amongst the youth, amongst working class youth, middle class youth. You have this kind of open anarchy and wonderful explosion of public art, of performance, of projected, no longer just on the internet, but projected clips on walls of buildings in working class neighborhoods with performances, totally blown out of the box of the new media. It's in the streets, it's everywhere, really amazing. As we're going to learn more about with our other two speakers, these kind of full-on massive uprisings amongst women and also very much against new working class groups. As our speaker's going to talk about, one of the interesting aspects of the lack of a defined leadership and the lack of political party representation amongst the youth and the left is that real unformalized, leaderless groups of working class youth are really absolutely dominating many aspects of this Tahrir public square. So we don't have a kind of formal leadership, but we have amazing mass, creative, expressive mobilizations by working class youth, including the famous ultras. What are ultras? Fans mostly in the soccer world, but now any singing stars can have ultra groups, but they are very, very, very well disciplined and organized, but without a particular political agenda, but with a bloodthirsty lust to destroy the police apparatus. So they have been battling it out hardcore and getting serious repression from it. I don't know if you heard a couple months ago about the massacre by the military of soccer fans in Port Said. It was not like, it was the New York Times the first day portrayed it as like one team versus the other, the kind of pro-Mubarak, anti-Mubarak discourse. It wasn't. The military closed the stadium, locked it up, turned off the lights, and sent in people to massacre ultras of one of the teams because the ultras of Ahli are the most radical against the military. So we're in this deadlock now. We have two public spheres, popular sovereignty sphere of Tahrir and the elected sphere of the kind of prerogative sovereignty of religious and military leaders. And the kind of swing votes in between, as I see it, are if some of the Salafiyah are going to become swing towards a kind of real kind of populism, a moral, pious populist movement against power, or the youth and the liberals of the Muslim Brothers are going to pull the brothers towards the Tahrir left, or if we're going to see, of course, a much more organized mass organization amongst the left for this redistribution coalition. So real quickly, I'll conclude by looking at some models of activism that are being examined by activists in the United States and elsewhere that the Egyptian revolution has produced. It's very interesting in looking at how to organize a revolution and how to make a different kind of revolution that addresses politics in a new way, looking to the future, looking to end the end of history and to start the history of social justice politics again. So one thing I talk about in my articles, if you want to read them, is this kind of politics versus, instead of identity politics, where we focus on secular versus religious, we focus on the issues of women standing alone or the issues of class standing alone, is this new politics that I call eversion. Eversion means turning something inside out. And I also like that it kind of sounds like perversion and inversion and all those other words that are really fun in terms of using those as frames for social movements. But anyway, eversion is this notion of, instead of battling identity versus identity or defending a minority status against a majority in the kind of humanitarian intervention sense, eversion means you turn an identity inside out, a repressed identity inside out, and you see how the state built it to serve the state's needs, and then you use that knowledge, you socialize that, and you turn against how hegemony produced that identity in the first place. So as Aida Saifullah there has done in terms of feminist anti-torture politics, instead of defending women against those awful working class men that harass them in the street, instead she engages in the politics of looking how the state made the woman such a fetish object of honor and social controversy, and how the state mobilized both police, security, and working class gangs themselves in order to intimidate public space, in order to purge public space of its possibility to mobilize subversion or opposition, in order specifically to pull the carpet out from women-led labor movements and women-led democracy movements. So she turns out inside out and then leads protests against the state's manipulation of women's honor, the state's production of crises and panics around sexuality and the body, and keeps the focus on the security state apparatus, not on calling the police to protect the woman against the working class, which just enhances the interventionary power of the security state. Then we have, as I talked about a little bit, hacktivism versus the Facebook revolution, focusing on people in Egypt that again turn the security state inside out, surveilling those in power, revealing the holdings the military has in the economy, revealing the factories the military runs and how terrible how brutal their labor practices are in military-run factories, in putting videos of informants online instead of becoming informants for the state, again, turning the security state inside out, using the social media, rather than the social media being a kind of fun, happy place where people can express individuality. Instead, it becomes an actual counter-surveillance mechanism for popular sovereignty against domination. And then finally, what we've started to see since the Egyptian Revolution is this focus, like in the occupation of the Assembly in Wisconsin during occupation of Tahrir Square, seeing this notion of now uprisings happening in many places of the world at once, simultaneously, but without any defined common agenda or ideology between them, which actually becomes remarkably effective because that simultaneity produces this kind of projection effect in which simultaneity itself produces a notion of global humanity without ever defining what global humanity is, which rather than being a kind of weak kind of power, it's actually very powerful because anyone can project their own frustrations onto this global moment. And that becomes, therefore, produces the ability to imagine a global people struggling for social justice together. So the focus is on simultaneity instead of working out the details of similarity. So that produces much more between Greece, between Wisconsin, between Occupy, University of California, between Occupy, Tahrir. And finally, as indicated by the word I kept using, of course, what we've seen as a major transformation in politics is a shift from protests and demonstrations in which you have basically it's reduced. What is a protest usually defined as in the history books? The number of people that showed up and then the picture of one person with one sign where you have basically, what we're against, right? 2003, we had the world's largest global protest in the history of humanity against the invasion of Iraq, and it had no effect because Iraq was invaded, so then it just becomes a footnote to history. The nice thing about an occupation is it can't ever be reduced to just the number of people occupying it and one sign being held up. It has this kind of phantom effect in which it actually digs in, works hard to produce territory and to occupy territory. It's a kind of, to overuse the term inside out, but it's an inside out version of colonialism. It turns the power of coloniality against itself. It occupies, creates territory, creates claims, but that cannot be reduced to just the number of people there. It can't be reduced to some one person holding up one sign. It actually radiates out its attention back to the repressive apparatus. That's why it was the police attacks on Occupy that got all the attention, which is the way it should. It wasn't a particular one or two claims that the Occupy movement or the Tahrir occupation did. So new logics of eversion, of occupation, of simultaneity, moving beyond the politics of identity towards the politics of the people without totalizing and creating something devoid of issues like gender and class, but actually putting gender and class up there in an incredibly powerful new way that's dynamic. So I will leave some space for our next speakers, but thank you very much and support Egypt.